actually, I better think of. Okay, so I'll do it all later. So, first of all, thanks very much for agreeing to sit down with us today. I suppose the first question I probably have for you is, if somebody didn't know who Richard Boyd Barrett was, how would you personally describe yourself and the principles that you hold?
I think as an activist, primarily. That's how I got involved in politics. I never had any particular interest in getting elected. When I started out, and for probably the first 8, 9, maybe 10 years that I was politically involved, it didn't even occur to me to stand in elections. I began as somebody active in particular political movements, campaign, grassroots type movements, and I still see myself as essentially a grassroots campaigner. So I would have started in things like the anti-war movements during the first Gulf War, 1991. I'd just come back from Palestine, and that was really what made me got involved in politics, was because I'd been in Palestine, spent a year there. I was horrified by what I'd seen happen to the Palestinians, and then I kind of learned a bit more about the big picture of politics, the role of the United States in the Middle East. That led me into supporting the movement against the Gulf War in 1991, where the US coalition attacked Iraq. And I also simultaneously sort of stumbled into the campaign over the X case, when a 13-year-old girl was refused to travel to Britain for an abortion after she'd been raped. That created a huge movement in around the same time, and I got involved in that. And so one thing kind of led to another. And I've always really held the view that it's people power rather than electoral politics that brings change. So yeah, activist, I think is.
So you were heavily involved in the protests against the Iraq War in 2003 as well, weren't you?
I was. That was later, yeah, but it kind of followed on after the 9/11 atrocity, when the planes were flown into the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon, which was a horrific attack. But it was obvious to a lot of us activists that was going to be used, that atrocity was going to be used as a pretext to launch wars. The US would use it, and the sort of hawks in the Bush administration would use it as a pretext for war, first in Afghanistan, but later in Iraq. It was all fairly clear that was going to happen.
Yeah.
So at that stage, we held a big public meeting in Dublin, just weeks after the atrocity in New York and Washington. And a lot of people turned up, and we set up the Irish Anti-War Movement, and I was nominated as the chairperson of the Irish Anti-War Movement, and so I became one of the key organisers for the big protests in 2003, where we brought out about 100,000 people on the streets. It was a sort of coalition. It was the Anti-War Movement, Peace and Neutrality Alliance, and a thing called the NGO Peace Alliance.
Yeah.
But I would have been one of the kind of main organisers for that.
So I suppose, obviously, you mentioned about the anti-war movement and all that. What would be your sort of opinions in regards to the Irish Defence Forces then?
Well, funny enough, I have to talk about that today. Later, there's going to be a motion in the Dáil to deploy 14 Irish Rangers to Mali, to the civil war, effectively, that is going on in Mali. And we will be voting against it because I think that it's a very, very dangerous mission. It's the deadliest mission that the UN is running anywhere in the world. There's about close to 200 UN soldiers have been killed in the last 3 years. And it's, I very much respect, more than respect, admire the tremendous tradition of peacekeeping that the Irish Defence Forces have, in line with Ireland's neutrality, as not being aligned to any military alliance. But I'm very concerned that this significantly departs from that.
Yeah.
And that it's part of a slippery slope where Irish neutrality has been undermined by allowing Shannon to be used for the US to lead wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, by progressive involvement, push to get Ireland involved in evolving what I would see as an EU army, which is linked to NATO and the European Union, and a move away from peacekeeping that's happening with, it's interesting language. We used to talk about peacekeeping, now we talk about peace enforcement, and that's what they're talking about in Mali. Peace enforcement, as John Bruton, the Fine Gael former Taoiseach, once said, is a euphemism for war. Because every war is fought on the pretext we're eventually going to get peace, but you're trying to force a peace using military power, and that's war. And I don't think Irish troops should be involved in that. I think it's dangerous for them. I think it's very, very dangerous for our international reputation, which is very good internationally as a neutral power. And another point I'll certainly be making is that our defence force is very brave, courageous people, but they're very, very badly paid. I mean, we've seen protests of the defence forces recently because many of them are on family income supplements. They're struggling to literally put a roof over their head, many of our soldiers. So I think it'd be better if the government showed a bit of respect for our soldiers and for our neutrality rather than sending badly paid soldiers to fight in a very dangerous conflict which could have bad consequences.
So I suppose my main question would be, obviously the Taoiseach came out and said he wasn't going to be anywhere near going to restore the payment of the Defence Force to at least a decent wage that it should be given. I suppose one of the main comments he had on that would be if he gave this part of society a bigger pay, then it would have a trickle down effect. So what would your thoughts be on something like that?
Well, that's not a difficult one for me because I'm for and have been campaigning from the outset against what are called the FEMPI cuts, the emergency pay cuts to pay and pensions of public service workers, which include the Defence Forces. So I think they should all be restored, all of them, nurses, public health workers, doctors, the Defence Forces, everybody, teachers, everybody who got hammered with those cuts. They should never have been hammered with them in the first place. I mean, how, to my mind, it could only be Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil who would blame public service workers for a crash caused by bankers and private developers. So I always thought they were wrong, and I think the pay cuts they've suffered are completely unjust, so I'm for full restoration here and now. But I also think, Defence Forces are on the sort of lowest rung of the public service in terms of pay conditions, and that's, to my mind, just sort of beggars belief when you consider the danger that they have to put themselves in.
And it's also, as well, a statistic came out that they're actually the most trusted service within the Irish sort of state as well. People tended to have more sort of respect towards the army than any other sort of body.
Yeah, I think people have huge respect for the soldiers, for the rank and file soldiers, and indeed quite a few of them work here in the Dáil. When they get out of the army, they end up as service officers and ushers in here, and they're great people, and they've done immense service for the state and internationally, but they're not respected. They're not, and I think they're kind of political pawns, really, in terms of an agenda by parts of the political establishment to move us away from our traditional neutrality, but also just in terms of their day-to-day treatment and the paying conditions they have to put up with. It's just not really acceptable.
Yeah. So I suppose the party that you're involved with is People Before Profit. Now, is it a fair assumption to say that People Before Profit would consider themselves an anti-establishment party?
Definitely, yeah.
So
yeah.
I suppose the main question is, what would you consider the main bodies of the establishment to be?
Well, I think politically they're Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They have dominated the Irish state since its inception, and they have swapped power essentially on a sort of rotation basis for about 100 years, the best part of 100 years, and I don't think that has served us particularly well. We're now acknowledging, they are acknowledging, the horrors of the industrial schools, the Magdalen laundries, all that history of abuse where they relied on church institutions to really enforce a pretty horrendous, socially oppressive regime. While obviously our state has developed, I think it's developed in a way where the wealth and the benefits of economic development have accrued really to a relatively small group of people, often linked to those two big political parties or to the political support, the business supporters of those political parties. So they're two key pillars of the Irish establishment, but obviously I think you can probably see those networks then ripple into the tops of the very high echelons of the civil service, probably at the tops of the guards, judiciary, and so on, because a lot of those things were political appointments. So I think there's a sort of establishment network, which is pretty well entrenched in Irish society.
So if you talk about, let's say, reforming the establishment, would that be not just the government, so in the Dáil, would it also include the judiciary and the Gardaí as well?
Yeah, I think we need to democratise the institutions of the state to a far greater degree. And I would say the economy, that's a basic point that socialists make, is that even the best formal democracy in the world is a bit hollow if a tiny group of people control all the wealth, because they can use that wealth, and have, in my opinion, used it here and across the world, to essentially subvert democracy through their control of the media, through the political donations, through all sorts of influences that people with a lot of wealth can use to influence the political process. So I think a prerequisite to a more democratic society, a more transparent democracy, is a fair distribution of the wealth in society.
Surely, to be perfectly blunt, the idea that the 1%, they use the media and everything to sort of shape their own agendas, surely that's apolitical in nature, is it not?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm not sure how one could argue that. I mean, the biggest owner of the press in this country is a billionaire business person, right? We all know who he is, and we all know that he had connections, for example, to the Fine Gael government, and those matters were looked into in the Moriarty tribunal. He got a major state contract which dramatically changed his personal fortunes, right? So that sort of nexus of big business and politics is very apparent, and indeed we've had a succession of tribunals around planning issues. There was tribunals around the relationship between the beef industry and some of the big beef barons in this country and the big political parties. So I think there's lots and lots of evidence of this interconnection of wealth and the political establishment and some of the key institutions in the state. And I think we have to break through that. And it really means a sort of grassroots, root and branch from the bottom up democratization of our society.
So that would be the alternative in your eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. And as very much as part of that is about equalising the distribution of wealth and income in our society, as well as that democratization of institutions.
So would you say sort of a Marxist approach to it nearly?
Well, yeah, I mean, these labels have become somewhat meaningless, but certainly, yeah, I would subscribe to the basic analysis of Karl Marx, or James Connolly for that matter, that capitalism is a system that is driven purely by competition for profit, and that competition for profit, which dominates the global economy today, and Marx argued this was true from the 19th century onwards, leads to an ever greater concentration of wealth in a smaller and smaller number of hands, and it also leads to an inherent sort of cycle of economic boom and bust. All of those things have come to pass, and we saw the devastating consequences of that type of economy in 2008, where the greed for profit of the financial institutions, of people trying to make money out of property, literally crashed the entire global economy. So I think that analysis has been borne out, and I do think we can do better than that. I mean, Marx or Connolly, or for that matter, people for profit or the left, don't have a blueprint for exactly what the alternative is, but because I think it has to be created in a really democratic way through movements of people power. But in broad terms, I think the outlines of that alternative are about saying, let's start by putting people before the profits of a few. Let's meet basic needs like housing, like health, like the key infrastructure we need, like the environment we need to sustain ourselves. Let's start with those priorities rather than the priorities of the market and profit.
Okay. I suppose this is an argument used quite generally when talking about socialism or even communism, is the idea that if you look at sort of the past and you look at, say, Mao's China or Stalin's Russia, and not to say that those are definitely not socialist states, I wouldn't say in the sort of the definition that has been given now, but they did sort of originate from those sort of ideologies, and then it kind of branched out that people took advantage of it, and that's how it became the sort of dictatorship it did. And even look at more modern now, Venezuela has kind of come to sort of the same near enough standards that it had back then. So, I suppose my question to you is, I could get behind the idea of Marxism and maybe the ideas of a socialist state, whatever. In theory it sounds brilliant, but actually practicing it out and relying on certain figureheads in the state to not want to grab power, how is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. First of all, all of those states that you refer to, I would not refer to as socialist states. I mean, but it's absolutely true to say they often use the language of socialism, and some of them might even claim some descendancy to radical socialist or communist movements. But you see, I don't think you judge things by their labels. I think you judge things by what they actually do and what the reality of those states is. So, the communists in China can call themselves communists, they can claim some Marxist legacy. But today I'll be speaking in the Dáil about why I'm on the side of the protesters in Hong Kong who are fighting efforts by the Chinese regime to essentially extradite them to China, to where it's a brutal dictatorship. And I don't care that the Chinese Communist Party call themselves leftists. I'm on the side of the people on the streets in Hong Kong, because to me, real socialism is about supporting the struggles of ordinary people for greater freedom, for greater self-determination, for greater control over their lives and the institutions and wealth in their society, regardless of the banner they fight under. And that was also the reason why I, for example, and my political tradition of socialism would have supported the revolutions in 1989 against the Eastern European dictatorships. Some of the left defended those dictatorships. I think that was a ghastly mistake, because I think if Karl Marx or James Connolly were alive, they would have been supporting the people on the streets, fighting for self-determination. And you might say, well, but yeah, okay, fine, but is there somehow a connection between the good ideas of Marx or Connolly and the bad outcome of Stalin? Well, you could say, is there a connection between the 1916 rebels and the Magdalen laundries? You could make the same argument. I don't think there is. The fact that governments that came to power after the Irish Revolution did horrendous things, and often did those horrendous things in the name of the Irish Revolution, to me does not discredit the Irish Revolution.
Sorry, just to interject, but to be fair, when you compare, let's say, the idea that we could talk about, are the rebels responsible for the Magna laundries, which I wouldn't agree with at all, obviously, that's what you're saying, but I wouldn't have even imagined that the government that got to power afterwards would have been a socialist government. So they wouldn't have held those ideals, I don't think. I think a lot of the people who were for a socialist republic died during the 1916 Rising, James Connolly being one of them.
That's exactly the point of what happened in places like Russia. So exactly the same process. And I think, in fact, it would be far more useful if you sort of cut away the labelling. I'd say there's a tremendous analogy between the betrayal of the Irish Revolution and the betrayal of the Russian Revolution, just to give you one example.
Okay.
Because, of course, what Stalin did is he killed all the original revolutionaries. That's what he did. And as you rightly say, most of the people who actually made the Irish Revolution got killed, and certainly didn't inherit the state that they had fought for.
Yeah.
And so to me, and I think many people would say this in Ireland, the ideals of the Irish Revolution, of the democratic programme, have not been realised. We wouldn't say, therefore, the Irish Revolution was a waste of time. We'd say, actually, let's realise the aspirations of the revolution. And I think we'd say the same about socialism. Yeah. The fact that other people, to use a phrase, bastardise the memory and the ideas of the revolution for their own cynical purposes doesn't, to my mind, undermine the revolutionary aspirations. It just means we've got to fight to make sure that they are genuinely realised.
Okay, well, so let's just take it back a minute now. So in regards to, you would say that you maybe subscribe to some ideologies in regards to Marx or different bits, but would you consider, if someone was to ask you, and I know you don't like the idea of labels for political ideology, but if you were to say, would you describe yourself as a socialist?
Yes, I would describe myself as a socialist.
So, I suppose...
A revolutionary socialist, even.
I suppose one of my main queries is, and I think this is quite fascinating, because you went to St. Michael's College, yeah, and it's not that there's anything wrong with St. Michael's, but surely socialist views probably wouldn't have been looked at in a positive light probably in St. Michael's, would they?
No, they wouldn't. I can't remember them ever being discussed, certainly, in there. But, I mean, people from the socialist tradition have come from all sorts of backgrounds. Connolly obviously came from, a tremendously humble background in Glasgow. But Marx came from quite a well-off background, so did Engels. I think where you come from is less important than what you do, and where you end up, and what you're fighting for, and the individual journey of people to that. It can vary. I mean, in my case, I think it was probably because I had gone to a national school before St. Michael's. I wasn't always in St. Michael's, and of course I didn't control what school I was sent to. My parents sent me there, but so from a young age I had mixed with people from different social backgrounds, and in a way, when I went to St. Michael's, which was more sort of middle class, upper middle class even, I was aware of the contrast, and I think that made me think politically about social divisions. Because the contrast was so apparent to me, and I began to question it. I think partly for that reason. If I'd always gone to a private school, maybe I wouldn't have questioned it. I just would have taken it for granted. But the fact that I had, from a very young age, mixed with people from different social backgrounds, made me aware of the inequalities in society when I went to places like St. Michael's.
So obviously you mentioned that maybe socialism wasn't really discussed in St. Michael's, which is fair enough. It's a secondary school education. It's probably heavy-hitting stuff for someone who's going through the leaving cert. But would you say that maybe going to St. Michael's was actually a benefit to you because it exposed you to, say, views you wouldn't totally agree with, and it made you challenge yourself and question what you were really thinking?
I think pretty much every experience in life is probably a benefit for you. You learn something from it, and of course you learn something about different echelons of society, how they operate. And there were some good teachers there. Don't get me wrong, but I still come firmly to the conclusion at the end of it that we've got to get rid of a two-tier education system. I don't think it's right that people get certain advantages because they happen to have the money to pay for a private education which has more resources or better connections in society. I think that's wrong. I think the two-tier health service is wrong. I don't think your access to health services should be determined by how much you can pay. But that's the situation in Irish society, and I'm for eliminating that. I don't say that out of some sort of grudge or resentment against, because I understand how things have evolved. I understand why people take private health insurance out because of fear of the public health service. I understand that people pay fees to get their kids to certain schools because they're worried that the public education system is not as well resourced and well funded as it could be or should be. But I still think we need to deal with that problem. We shouldn't perpetuate an inequality. We should challenge it and seek to make things fairer.
I suppose another question that I have, which is going back to politics again, you're obviously in alliance with Solidarity at the moment in the Dáil, and you're the fifth largest party in the Dáil. Say if you were to go in the morning and your party was the majority in government and you were making all the laws, how would you change society around you now? Or at least what would you prioritise in the election cycle?
Well, it'll be a very radical programme, let me tell you, that we'd be proposing. I mean, we would want to fundamentally change the situation where the wealth is heavily concentrated in the hands of the top 10%. So that we would have a very, very radical programme for the redistribution of wealth through taxing corporate profits, through taxing the income of very, very high earners to try and redistribute that wealth. But everybody, we would argue, would benefit for it because we would introduce very, very radical social measures. Nobody would ever have to worry about having a secure, affordable roof over their head. That would be a basic right. We would invest huge amounts of money in areas like education and health to ensure that people had, state-of-the-art, single-tier, universal health, education, all those key services, so that people didn't have, suffer poverty, deprivation, insecurity, all those things which I think are very corrosive of our society. We'd have a very, very radical programme in terms of dealing with issues like climate change. Free public transport to get people out of their cars, heavy subsidisation of public transport, big programmes of retrofitting homes which would reduce people's energy bills, but where the state would lead it, develop, heavy investment in research and development in renewable energies directly in our own universities, which would create lots of jobs and help deal with this environmental crisis that's hurtling towards us. I mean, you can go through the list of different policies, but it would be a very radical transformation we would be pushing for.
So I suppose mainly the main thing you'd be focused on is making everything more accessible, would it?
Yeah, I mean, well, basic things and the basic infrastructure necessary for society to kind of exist.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that Marx and Engels did, which I think is very useful for anybody to look at, regardless of what political conclusions they might draw, is they looked at historical development. And one of the things they pointed out is that society previously in history had reached very, very high levels, sophisticated levels, in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, in ancient Mesopotamia. And those societies collapsed back into the Dark Ages. Again and again and again, you had societal collapse. And they made the point, why did this happen? And that they essentially say it was because of the inequality in the distribution of wealth and the fact that the small group at the top who controlled all the wealth started to forget about the need to invest in the basic infrastructure that sustained those societies. So they became greedy and lost sight of what society needed to survive. And the consequence of that was societal collapse. Now, I think if you bring that on to today, the consequences of societal collapse will be much more devastating because it's a much more globalized world. And it's a world where societal collapse will now also mean environmental collapse. So we cannot afford that. Society and human beings cannot afford a collapse on the scale that we saw in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, or ancient Mesopotamia. So to me, there's a huge urgency to address the social, economic, environmental problems facing us. Otherwise, we will pay a very, very bitter price.
So you mentioned free transport and all that. I think there's not many people who'd be against that idea, but like in a society now where we see so many cutbacks coming from everywhere, when you talk about education, about nursing, how where's the money going to come to fund this? Is it from that 10% that you were saying earlier, or is it from other areas?
You see, this is the irony of the situation we're in. The world is wealthier in absolute terms now than it has ever been at any time in human history. So isn't it odd? If you think about it, most of the time because people are trying to deal with their day-to-day struggle for survival, they don't have time to sit back and sort of reflect on this. But if you sit back and reflect, isn't there something very strange about the fact that the world is more wealthy than it's ever been, and yet basic things that you need to survive are going backwards? So our housing situation is worse than it was 20 years ago when we were poorer. Isn't there something wrong there? The wealth is going somewhere that it shouldn't be instead of going into the housing. You could say the same about the health service. I mean, you did not have queues for the public health service that lasted 2 or 3 years for basic procedures 20 years ago. And yet we're wealthier today, but we've longer queues. There's something wrong. How could that be, right? I mean, I think it's very clear when you actually look at it. What's happened is the wealth is being sucked up to the top. And a small group of people have now got astonishing amounts of wealth. It's not just us saying it. In the CSO, finally, belatedly, the Central Statistics Office have started to collect statistics on this. They didn't before that. It was only because the likes of us started pressuring in the Dáil over the last 5 or 6 years for them to collect statistics on wealth distribution. But lo and behold, when they do collect them, they confirm what we've said. The top 10% in Irish society control 54% of the wealth. Right? That's absolutely unsustainable. And that means the bottom sort of 50% have about 20% between them. So the people at the bottom, the majority, are scrambling around fighting over the crumbs, while at the top there's people with wealth beyond imagination. I mean, that is not sustainable. I mean, it's not fair, but it's also not sustainable for our society. And that picture is replicated globally. As Thomas Piketty has probably done the most comprehensive study of that, his book Capital, where he really details in an absolutely comprehensive sort of encyclopedic way all the facts and statistics and figures on the huge growth in the inequality in the distribution of wealth and income that has grown and grown and grown over the last 20, 30 years. And unless we address that, I think society is heading to a pretty dark place, and we're certainly determined to fight to change that.
Obviously, I think people always talk about the left in Ireland, and I think in some regards there are more parties on the left than there are on the right in Ireland, but obviously, as a lot of people will say, that the right in Ireland probably, yeah. Well, I mean, personally, which parties would you consider to be on the right of the spectrum then?
At the moment, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, the Independent Alliance, Aim 2, Renua. Those would be the main ones. So you've got.
How much pull do they really have though? Because Aim 2 are like only a new party, not really having established themselves yet. Renua haven't really done much in the last few years. Fine Gael, I could say, yes, of course, yeah, I'd call them a right-wing party, but even for me personally, and I think for a lot of people may see Fianna Fáil as more of a centrist party.
Yeah, and Fine Fáil would probably like to present themselves as a centrist party, but there was nothing centrist about the policies they pursued in the run-up to the crash in 2008. Or indeed, I would say there was nothing centrist pursued by Fianna Fáil going back to Charlie Haughey at least. If we could debate the history before that, but Haughey marked a very decisive move on the part of Fianna Fáil behind big business at the expense of Irish society, most notably in the beef industry with their relationship with the beef barons. And of course that era was marked by rampant corruption, which was all discovered later in the tribunals. To me, that's the politics of the right. I don't see how you can describe that as centre, certainly not left. And in all the key sort of economic areas, they take much the same positions as Fine Gael. So they might rhetorically tack a bit more left than Fine Gael sometimes. But in terms of their key sort of economic positions, they pursued, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael pursued the same policies in the run-up to the crash in 2008, largely. And they largely pursued the same austerity policies after the crash in 2008, where they made the majority of ordinary people pay the price for a crisis created by an elite that they themselves had been championing. So that, to me, is the politics of the right. It's not the politics of the centre, and it's definitely not the politics of the left. Now, the left is fragmented. If you're saying, is the left fragmented? Yes, the left is fragmented. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the only left that existed in Ireland for a long time was the Labour Party, and the Labour Party made a disastrous decision every single time it got the opportunity, every time in the history of the state, to prop up either Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. And that had disastrous consequences for them. But it also means that we never really built a strong left in Ireland, and we're dealing with the consequences of that. Now, I'm for creating a strong left, and I'm for the left staying out of government with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and trying to campaign and build and organise for a day when we can actually have a left government.
So let's say if there is a general election, I know there's a lot of speculation about it maybe coming in September or sometime after that. So obviously I mentioned that there's quite a few left-wing parties, like you look at the Socialist Party, yourselves, Solidarity, you've got the Greens, you've got Labour, Social Democrats, and that's only to name a few. There's probably more I've missed out on. What is it that a person going to the polls, and particularly a young person going to the polls, when they're going to vote, why should they vote for people before profit as opposed to any of the rest of them?
I think first of all because our politics are marked by a people power approach, which I think we're unique in. You see, it's easy to have policies and branding, and I'm not, and of course those things are terribly important, and we have very detailed policies and stuff. But as we've seen time and time again, people say certain things before elections and then they do something completely different, and that's discredited politics very badly. Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, obviously, but Labour saw electoral destruction effectively at the last election because they promised a whole series of things before 2011 and then did the opposite. The Greens did the same with Fianna Fáil in the government prior to that. We will not do that. And we have an emphasis on people power to bring change. And I think our record is second to none, really, in sticking to our principles and actually fighting on a grassroots basis for whatever, against the water charges, in the repeal, the 8th campaign. We were, I would say, the most active on the ground in actually building the repeal 8 campaigns, or if you think about, the campaign to stop the sell-off of the forests, we spearheaded that campaign. In my own area, part of the reason I got elected is because we spearheaded campaigns to stop the privatisation of the seafront. We've been central to trying to organise a big national campaign on public and affordable housing. We're very actively involved in the anti-racist movements, building campaigns like United Against Racism.
That's with Mehmet, isn't it?
With Mehmet. So just on every kind of issue you can mention, and that's not by any means an exhaustive list, we have a very people-powered grassroots approach. And we're very keen to and actively seek to work with others on the left in those campaigns. So we don't just say, join people for profit or else we don't want to talk to you. We don't do it like that. We get involved in building what we would call united front campaigns with others on the left and people who are not aligned to anybody around specific issues to try and get tangible results on environmental issues, on social issues, and economic issues. But, you know, I think we're unique in that regard, because I think most conventional political parties tend to say, vote for us, get us into government, and we'll do it for you. And I think we have a different approach to that.
I suppose my final question then is, after I'm gone and after you're gone, how would you like people to remember you by?
I don't even remember. I don't really care how they remember me. I'd more care, have we built a strong left that is actually making a real difference to people's lives? You know, building the capacity on the ground of ordinary people to fight on the issues that affect them and make a difference to their lives or make a difference to the environment around them. That to me is more important. So when I croak it, I hope we have very strong people before profit or left-wing government. That would be the more important thing than whatever people may have thought about me.
Well, Richard Boyd Barrett, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers.